Hello, hi, what's up? It's me, Karen, your favorite booktuber, and we're back again to do what we always do this time. We're talking about the books that I read in May. I read about 9 books, but we're going to be talking about 10 because the 10th book I actually finished on June 1st, but I did most of the reading in the month of May, so I just want to wrap that up, put a little pin in it. Okay, that preamble's all sorted. Let's talk about the first book that I read. That was Ladies of the Rachmaninoff Eyes by Henry Van Dyke. This book is a McNally's edition. I have waxed poetic about these books because I just love their paper quality and I think they're delightful. This is an interesting book. This book in particular is the story of a young gay black man who is living with his Aunt Harriet, I think her name is, and Etta, who is a wealthy widow. And these two women have a very codependent relationship. They are constantly bickering, yet they have an intense love and understanding and a lifelong relationship, and they cannot exist without the other person. In the foreword, it's described as being a very campy novel, and I definitely get that. There are some real moments of, melodrama and fun and excess and just little crazy instances, but at the same time I kind of wish it went there a bit more. This book is dealing with an incident in the summer right before our protagonist is about to head to New York for college. We don't get a lot of his emotional world per se, but from some other reading that I did after reading this book, I got the understanding that he's quite sad, especially towards the end of the novel, which you'll find out if you read the book why. But he is kind of living in the shadows of a young man who recently passed away. This man was the younger son of Etta, the wealthy Jewish woman of the house, and both Etta and Aunt Klein loved this boy. Sergeant was his name, and he committed suicide in New York, and the family is haunted by the specter of his ghost almost. They are constantly thinking about him. The women have such a strong love for him, so much so that the other brother who does survive, Jerome, no one cares about him. And what these two women do is that they want to commune with Sergeant again, so they call up a warlock to come through to the house, and that results in a few shenanigans. I think this book is really interesting. As I've said with all of the McNally's edition books, they leave me with lots of not questions, but they're just such interesting novels. Even if I don't necessarily love the book, I still am with it for the ride to see where the author takes us, their different ways of storytelling and the language. I just do enjoy these books, even if I don't necessarily love the book. But I do want to take a second to read an excerpt because I do think that our author wrote about some of the characters in such a compelling way. In particular, I was really fascinated by the description of Jerome's wife. So we're going to go to page 52, and I will read you a little section if you would just kindly listen to me. I know it's a big ask, but we're about to dive right into it. I sat across from Jerome's wife. She was tall. Her hair looked enormously beauty parlored, but it had, for all of its intricacy of design, a good measure of dowdiness. If she had beauty, it was a cautious and polite beauty, and if it was not beauty she had, then her plainness was expensively disguised. What Jerome saw in her 20 years ago when he was courting her was not easily discernible, for even in the most concentrated conjuring, it was impossible to bring forth images of her indulging in ardor, necking in a car seat, being clandestine, as Aunt Harry and Mrs. Klein had often hinted. For one thing, her mouth was all wrong for love. It was such a severe red line, a cut really across her powdered face. The middle of her lips were perpetually puckered, as though she were about to say something in French. And for one thing, she didn't have much neck. She was tall and slender, but after her shoulders, her head came suddenly without enough preparation. Yet she wasn't a truly ugly woman. Yeah, I just like that image, that contrast, that the sharp cut of her lips, but then perpetually puckered. I really enjoyed some of these descriptions. There is a sequel, I suppose you could say. It's called Strawberries something or other, and it's on Internet Archive, and I think I'm going to read it because I am a little bit intrigued by what our narrator got up to. And I do think that possibly I may have been calling the aunt the wrong name, but forgive me if I did. After that, I read Worry by Alexandra Tanner. This is looking at family dynamics. In particular, we are analyzing or observing the relationship between sisters and the mother. So our narrator is, her name is Jules. She's 28. She's living in New York. This is pre-pandemic. She has a remote job, which she should be very lucky for, because a remote job is awesome. We love to be working remote. And so anyway, so she has this job. She's trying to be in a relationship. She's trying to live, but she's very isolated and alone. And like a lot of young people, she does spend a lot of time online. And her younger sister has had a handful of problems, and she happens to move in with Jules in New York. And the sister kind of loves her sister, obviously, but also resents her intruding upon her space. And so the book covers about like 9 months to a year. We're looking at this relationship like very intensely. We're looking at the fights. We're looking at when things are going well. We're looking at how they can like be snapping at each other, arguing, and then the next second looking at their phone, talking shit about someone else. Like, that's the dynamic. And they also both have a very fraught relationship with their mother, because their mother's quite manipulative and a little like crazy. I honestly wish we got so much more of the mother. I think this book is like, it's crazy to me because I kind of know a family exactly like this. There is a father figure, but he just is so hands off in the regards that when the mother and the children are fighting, he's just like, whatever your mother says. And so that's also an interesting dynamic to explore. And I would say that I really wish we got more of the mother. I think those moments when they are all three sisters and mother together is like really lots of material to work through, because their relationship is so bad. It's the kind of book that makes you like feel grateful for your own family. That's what I have to say about this. After that, we switched gears and I read James by Percival Everett. This is a retelling of the adventures of Huckleberry Finn, taking the character of Jim and just fleshing him out completely, getting into an understanding of what he got up to in this book. Gotta take a sip of water. If I am going to be honest with you guys, I have never read The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. I have a very vague understanding of what went down in that book. I did consider reading the book, but then I read some reviews that were like, you really don't need to. But the reason I even picked up this book, because I'm going to be even more honest, I read an interview with Percival Everett, and I really enjoy the way his brain works and like his answers to questions. I find him to be really thoughtful, but also like funny. And when he was speaking about The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, he spoke about how it had a certain place in American letters. And I just really like that verbiage. Like, I'm sure other people have said things like that before, that other people quite often use the parlance of American letters. But I was really just like, I need to read this. I need to see how we are reimagining American letters. Anyway, so that's why I picked up this book. I would say Percival Everett's style, having read now 2 of his books, not that I can be an expert because he's dropped like so many books. He's published more than 20. Yeah, right? I don't know. He's published a lot of books, but the 2 that I have read, this one and The Trees, I find them both. He's an author who's really focused on dialogue. It is through dialogue that a lot of the work happens in his novels. Like, yes, there are some descriptions in this book, but not very many. Like, I understand that they are, sorry, I got distracted. I understand that they're like sailing down the Mississippi River, but he doesn't spend a lot of time really giving you a lot of descriptions of environment and space or even people. It is through dialogue that the author, the protagonist, that they are like grappling with the ideas. And I think that's really fascinating to see the way that dialogue works in this book. Anyways, when we start off, we learn very quickly that James and the slaves around him are engaging in an act of covert resistance. When they are speaking to white people, when white people are around, they use a certain kind of parlance, slaves speak, but then amongst themselves, they speak proper. They are code switching, and that is a very important thing that pops up throughout the novel, the ways in which is a form of resistance and also helps them have identity. I think that was really interesting. We see, I think it's like hard for me to talk about this book because I did have such a almost like emotional reaction to it. I think I did cry towards the end. I found it to be really compulsive. You're swept along, you're moving very quickly. I didn't want to put the book down. I probably read it in 2 days. We're seeing James interacting with Huck. We're seeing that relationship form. We're seeing them being separated, reunited. James at one point is bought and sold and then bought again, and ends up singing in a little minstrel group, which is very, demanding. We're seeing James working through his feelings on slavery, and there's like a strong feeling of rage that he feels for what he has to endure, for what his community, for his family, what his people have to endure, and it is just so powerful and so just emotionally charged. I think that this was a book that I'm really glad that I read, and that's all I'm going to say about that. I hope, you should definitely check this one out. After that, I read Goyhood. This was kindly sent to me by the author, and excitingly enough, I interviewed the author, so you should expect to see, or it's already up, depending on when this video goes up, but I interviewed the author, and that video should be live on my channel now or very shortly. And this is a story of Mayer, who is like a 40-year-old man who is living a very religious life. He's an Orthodox Jewish man studying the religious texts, and he finds out that he's not actually Jewish. And so that sets him off on a little personal odyssey. He reunites with his brother. They go on a road trip down the deep south. They come across a 3-legged dog. He gets involved in a fight. Things are popping off. He's a birder. It's really interesting. It's a look at sibling relationships with God. I think this book is really fun to read, and you're swept along quite easily, but it's also grappling with philosophy and religion in a way that is very digestible, because our protagonist, he is shocked at this realization that he is not actually Jewish as he thought he was, and everywhere that he looks and that he turns, he can't help but process everything through this lens of religion, and he is constantly quoting scripture and has a line for every moment, and he's really just internally, he's like, what the fuck? I don't know who I am anymore. Has God abandoned me? And he's going off on this odyssey with his brother, and you're just seeing how he's grappling with all of this. I think it's a good summer read, We all go on road trips in the summer. This is a great companion for a road trip. Okay, after that, I read When Women Ruled the World. This was my first nonfiction book of the month because I was going to Egypt. I went to Egypt in May. It was awesome. Would recommend. 10 out of 10. It was so crazy. Anyways, I read this book because our author's premise is that it is still quite difficult and challenging for women to rule in America, and whether that's, or in the Western world in general, in most countries, world, whatever, whether that is in the corporate space or holding political office. She's wondering, why is that? And then she looks at history and she goes, Egypt was just as patriarchal as our current society, but yet why was it that there is a precedent of female queens, female regents, pharaohs? Why was it that this society would, oh my God, why is it that this society would put women on the throne? And so that's what she's unpacking. And I would have to say, I found this book to be really fascinating. We look at 6 female kings in Egypt. Obviously, the most famous that we know are Hatshepsut, Cleopatra, Nefertiti, and then there are 3 other earlier queens that she is looking at. What were the things that made it possible for these women to rule? And then once they did finish their term, how did the society change as a result of those women's leadership? Did it progress or move backward? And I thought this was really interesting because we all do, as students, I feel like across the world, know so much about Egypt, ancient Egypt in particular. It is something that's quite fascinating and exciting and interesting. And so she presents ancient Egypt in a way that I hadn't thought of before, that it actually was quite authoritarian and, these pharaohs were basically like dictators, and the ruling elite, the pharaohs and their, the people they kept close, they were not open to risk. They were very risk averse. They were really cautious people, and they didn't want to destabilize the community or rule. It was imperative to them that transitions of power occurred in the most seamless capacity. So what we see is that very early on in the early dynasties, maybe dynasty 1 through dynasty 4 or 5, every time the pharaoh died and they brought about a new king, when the pharaoh died, there would be ritual blood sacrifices of predominantly men, able-bodied men of the ruling elite. And these were not, these sacrifices, they occurred willingly. They can tell from analyzing the bodies and the way that they were buried, etc., that they weren't the result of like trauma or struggle or anything like that. Like, these people were willingly killing themselves to ensure that the next pharaoh would be able to rise without any threats on him, that no one else would try to take over or lead a coup, whatever it was. By the 5th or 6th dynasty, they stopped doing this. But that was, in the beginning, how they solidified power, and it was something that really had an effect throughout the generations, such that it cemented the fact that when a new pharaoh was born, or a new pharaoh came into power, other men wouldn't be out looking to tussle. And I think that is such a fascinating revelation, that stability was valued so much. And it would get to the extent that because pharaohs were considered divine rulers, if there was no feasible male relative to take the throne would then go to the next most plausible female. And she would be looked upon for leadership, because she would not, most likely, disrupt the kingdom, as she was considered probably to be less aggressive and whatever, and more thoughtful. So they would look to her to take power. And there were most instances she would act as a regent king to a young son or to a brother, whatever it may be. And we often saw that when women were ruling, the country did flourish, unless of course there were like outstanding factors for why they couldn't. Let's say there were droughts in the Nile, whatever. And so that's really interesting. And you see then how when some of these women would take more power, then as a result, the next pharaoh would do everything in his power to, circumvent her achievements, to erase her from history. And we see that a lot with Hatshepsut. And then we also learn when we look to Nefertiti, because she's an interesting figurehead in history, because this is someone who's known primarily for her beauty, but the author makes a case that most likely because she was married to, I want to say Amun-Re, he was the one pharaoh who decides to forgo the religion of the time and make his own religion. He's venerating the sun and changes up society in a way that most people did not like. And so he died, and then Nefertiti became queen regent. But the author argues that she was actually fashioning herself as a king. And there's just like a lot of interesting historical research happening. And then she goes on to say that she ruled as king for 6 years and basically changed up everything her husband was doing and brought the society back to the religion of before, and tried to stabilize the nation. Yeah, and then we look at Hatshepsut and the way in which I feel like in some regards some of the things that I'm saying might be a bit obvious, because maybe you already know. Yeah, so this book, I found it to be really interesting just to see the ways in which women were ruling, how they were able to do it, how they would, especially Hatshepsut, who before she became queen, I think was like a priestess, how she was able to rely on the priest and the trappings of religion to really assert her power and to use that as a propaganda tool. I just thought it was a really interesting book, but I recommend. I think it's just so fascinating to read about history. After that, I read Rejections, which was brought to you by NetGalley. And Rejections is Tony's sophomore novel book. They are short stories. And I would have to say, for people who are already, like, if you're watching this and you're like, ew, I hate short stories, think again. Sit down. These short stories, though they could stand on their own as standalone pieces, they're all working together. They are somewhat connected. You see characters from one story popping up in somewhere else. Like, Tony has created a world, and these short stories are looking at rejects, people who in our current day and time are basically, for lack of a better word, they are losers. Whether they are an incel, a woman who can't find a relationship, that weird CEO guy, like, these are people. Yet they are so isolated, they are so alone, and they all kind of like vaguely somewhat know each other, and it's kind of like, maybe if you guys all talked and were less secretive, you could find someone. But anyways, they don't, because we live in the time of the internet and isolation, and instead they are just in their brains the whole time. I would say that, you know, Tony is literally going inside these people's head and giving us like every thought that they have, their full entire, like, everything that they're thinking. So it's not really like, you're not getting like the full-on descriptions of the space or anything like that. Like, this is really like esoteric in that regards. Like, we are very much so in these characters' head. So much so that there are occasionally moments, like, even though these people are crazy, there are moments that they say something and you're kind of like, whoa, like, I vaguely had that thought, or like, you know, I've kind of felt that way. Because what we're looking at is, we're looking at the ways in which the internet has isolated us, the way that identity politics are working and forming people, such that, you know, we have this character, the feminist, who's saying it with his chest that he's a feminist, and then ends up becoming an incel and doing some not good things. And it's as if Tony has like put up a mirror to our society and been like, look at what's going on. I think it was really well done. It was very, like, in some regards, like, intense in that regards, because of how just crazy our day and time is and the realities of it. But I just think it was such a smart book that gets very meta towards the end, because Tony also includes a rejection letter of the book, and it just wraps everything up quite nicely. Would recommend this. I really need to read Private Citizens. Like, that's next on my reading agenda. After that, I read another book that is focused on the internet. This book is my first book by Honor Levy, which is a really fun title. I love the cover of this book, eye-catching blue, the like internet motif, cute and fun. These short stories are very, very, very short. They are very fixated on the internet. This book has been marketed as a Gen Z book. And if you have to know, I'm going to say this, so I guess you do have to know, I really dislike generational discourse. I find it to be so boring, just so uninspiring. It is something that really grates me. I don't care. I find that to be dull. And I think it's just like one of those things. It's just another version of like an identity politics type of business. It is just a marketing ploy. We spend way too much time thinking about it, using these terms, everything like that. Anyways, Honor Levy's book has been described as, you know, the voice of a generation, the Gen Z first type of book of this kind out there, showing us what it's like to have grown up with the internet. Now, I think that there are really some like funny moments, some moments of levity, but there's also a lot of it does feel a little dated, which is unfortunate when you're writing about the internet. And I don't even know, maybe that's like not even a good like criticism to give. The stories that are really good are really good. The others, they're stories. After that, I decided to once again go back to McNally's, and I read Winter Love. This book is really interesting. This is looking at our protagonist, our main character. Her name is Red. She is relaying a really key early romance in her life to a girl named Mara. They were both students together. We were once girls together, right? Does anyone know what I'm talking about? Anyways, this is very much so like kind of this book, but not really, because it is not a happy sapphic story. Red, as we come to discover in this book, has experienced a lot of pain in her life. Her father died fairly young. Her mother also died young. Like, she has been alone, she has been isolated, and there have been times where other women have taken advantage of her. Now she is about 20, 21 years old. She's in college. It is the end of World War II, and there are not a lot of men around. And she has dalliances with women, which, as she points out early in the book, is something that all the women are doing. And it's just a phase, and they will all get married. But she enters into a relationship with Mara. Mara is a married woman who carries herself with like an elegance and a style that is unnatural for the time, and she's drawn to her, and they embark into a relationship that starts off quite pleasant, but then gets very fraught as they are unable to truly communicate, and Red has a lot of baggage, and so does Mara in her own way. But Mara is a very enigmatic figure. I kind of wish we got the story through her point of view, because I was also charmed by her and I wanted to be inside her head. But she's very like fanciful and an artist at heart, and not someone who's focused on practicalities. And then as we discover as the novel progresses, we see what ends up happening with Red, and we see how this relationship with Mara is, why am I still holding the book? We see how this relationship with Mara is one that marks her forever, for the rest of her life, and she is always thinking about this. As a result of that, a lot of the language does sometimes get, a little overbearing, as generally first loves tend to be. It's quite, just over the top, so obsessed, whatever. But what I did like about this book, what I really, really loved, is there's occasionally some sentences about London in the winter, and those descriptions were just, lush isn't the right word, because lush is green and like verdant and beautiful, but they were so stark and, somber yet cold and icy. I don't know. I really like those descriptions. I'm going to read you one because I just have to, right? This is on page 14 and moves on to page 15. London was all beautiful pictures, gray and silver, delicate airy buildings traced against silver sky, the balloons anchored puffs swaying in a sprightly wind, even the sunlight was silvery. I don't know, I just really like considering a wintry London in this light, because some of those descriptions I was just, it was interesting language to talk about anchored puffs swaying. I just really enjoyed it. I really liked the book for that reason. And then the final fiction book that I read was Tokyo Express. This is a Penguin modern classic. This is a murder mystery. I don't often read murder mysteries. I think I was really drawn to this book because of the cover. I can't really speak about this genre very much because it's not something that I really read about a lot. I would say that it's like starts at one spot with one character, an elderly police officer in like this coastal town, and then switches to this like young city police detective. And I found that a bit jarring, because when I'd read the back, I thought that both these guys were going to be working a bit more closely in tangent, like would be working a lot closer together, and that was not the case at all. And instead we see, it was an interesting book though. Okay, so we see that we start off with two beautiful hot people have supposedly committed like a double suicide. So these two beautiful people have committed suicide, and what seems like a suicide ends up being a bit more, as like the first officer is like, what's going on here? Something seems sus. And then we move to Tokyo, and we're seeing the police detective trying to work it out. And what's interesting here is that you're seeing how modern technology has really like changed the game for crime. So the protagonist is, the prime detective, he's looking at the train time schedule, he's looking at planes, like compiling all of this information to get to the bottom of everything. And you're seeing like his thought process through every single thing, and the way that, I'm basically explaining like a murder mystery book to you, but you get what I'm saying. And what is the most compelling thing is that we're seeing how modernity is affecting crime, right? And so the repeating motif here is how the suspects are moving through time and space by manipulating modern technology. And like that's the key little thing here. And I thought that was like really interesting. There were times where, because they're covering like all of Japan in trying to like solve this little mystery, and there were times where it was a little hard for me to keep track of all of the names, but that's because I didn't study the map close enough. But that's just such a small issue. So that's a wrap on that book. And then the next thing that I read, I started it. This was an audiobook that I did, a nonfiction book called Strong Passions, A Scandalous Divorce in Old New York. I don't know why I picked this. This was not on my radar at all beforehand, but it was available on Levy, and I got it because I had a long drive to do. This is, okay, where do we even begin? This is the 19th century. The Civil War has kind of just culminated. There's a transition in society. We still have the Gilded Society and like all those people, but you know, they're not as cool as they used to be, but they're still out and kicking. And we are introduced to Mary and her husband, Peter. Now, Mary and Peter got married, they had kids, and they were living at Peter's in-laws' house because when Peter's father died, in his will, he wrote that the children would receive their inheritance so long as they stayed close to their mother. And close is obviously kind of subjective. It's not like he was like, they need to live within X amount of miles of wifey. They were just like close. So he decides he has to live at home. Though some people say he could have lived in the city or gotten his own house, blah, 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 whatever. Instead, he's living at the big family house. This is a joint family, okay? All the kids are basically living here, all the adult children and their spouses and whatever. And Peter is out and about in the world, and then Mary ends up having an affair with Peter's brother. And that is the story. That is what we are unraveling. And at that time, you know, divorce was quite tricky. You could only get divorced if one of the individuals had committed adultery, and there's all these rules and stipulations. Obviously, divorce has changed in this time and space, so it's, you know, very, like, you get what I'm talking about, right? Anyways, so Peter and Mary end up separating, and they are suing each other, and Peter wants custody of both kids because at that time, children were considered the property of the male father figure person, whatever. And so he's just like trying to get custody of both kids. And then what does Mary do? Mary takes the youngest daughter and runs off. And that's what this book is unraveling. It is looking at the court documents and the different statements people made and whatever, and like relaying all of this information. In some regards, towards the end, it gets a little bit boring because we kind of do find out all of the information in the beginning, and you kind of just like want to know more about like the what the consequences are of this. And this author is fixating on this because she's saying that the nation, the entire like US nation, was not enamored, fascinated by this case because the splitting of the husband and the wife, the family unit, resembled the split of the North and the South. And for that reason, there were like similarities, is what the author's trying to say. And that's why we're like focusing on this case. I kind of personally wish that we had looked at like other divorce cases and maybe looked a little bit more at what the general people were saying about this particular divorce case. We do get quotes from like Peter's cousin, I think his name is George, who was a really voracious, I don't know, he was a very active journaler. So there's quotes from him, but I just kind of wish at times that we got a bit of a broader scope. But we didn't. Instead, we're focusing like really specifically at this case and the actual like realities of the court case and the hearings, the various witnesses that came through, a bit of their backstories, the ways in which they may have been manipulated by the defendant and whatever. And it is really fascinating, very interesting. And I don't think it necessarily is for everyone, but it is a look at, you know, divorce, the relationships between the sexes at that time, the expectations of marriage at that time, but also like a lot of class stuff because we see how, you know, this was a marriage of two high society people, and, you know, some of the suspects who are brought, not suspects, but some of the witnesses who are brought on board, they are maids, or one woman is, you know, considered to have loose morals, and she is someone who, what is the word? She was like a woman doctor who would bring about abortions. And at one point in the case, the accusation is laid upon Peter that he forced Mary to have an abortion. And just, there's a lot to unpack in this book. Maybe not for everyone, but I thought it was really interesting. And then in the end, we find out some salacious details about their children and what happened to them, and just fascinating. So yeah, that was my month of reading. It was fun. Now we are in June, and I'm reading Once Upon a Time, which is the biography on Carolyn Bessette Kennedy. I've also started The Jasmine Throne, which is like a sapphic South Asian fantasy book. I'm also supposed to be reading Middlemarch, and I need to spend more time on that. And yeah, so much reading, so little time. I hope you had a fabulous reading month in May. Please let me know what you read, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you.